Hey, welcome back! This time I again have another great video that is inspired by the amazing work of Linear's team. 2 weeks ago I came across this video on Twitter that is posted by one of the co-founders of Linear. And what they've created is a custom tooltip that when you hover the bar, you see that it only shows part of the tooltip and moves up and down if your cursor is moving up and down as well. And I thought that was super inspiring and it just looks really nice. So that is what I want to recreate with you today. And to replicate that, we're not gonna go the frame motion route this time. We are gonna use basic CSS and JavaScript to do just this. And I hope I can amaze you by how simple it could be to recreate this without any of those JavaScript animation libraries. If we quickly switch over to the end result of today's video, this is the graph that we're gonna create. Let's just hover it and see how beautiful that tooltip simply is. And let me tell you, it's gonna be a super easy implementation this time. You're gonna like it. So let's dive in right away. So for the start of this video, I already went ahead and created this chart component. It's simply an SVG that renders a few bars, and each bar has some data, which are the blocks within a bar, and they are stacked on top of each other. There's a few utility functions, getX and getY, that decide what the exact position is of this element, but that's not part of this video, so for now we are gonna ignore that. If you are interested in how I did that, definitely look it up, but it's not the most beautiful code because that's not part of this video. And when you hover the chart right now, there is nothing that happens. We still need to add this tooltip and also make sure that we do the hover functionality. The first step I want to take is adding in this tooltip, just as a static component. And that we're gonna do by adding another div outside of our SVG, and that SVG will be our tooltip. First, let's add a class name on it. And then we're gonna make this position absolute and put it in the top left corner by adding top 0 and left 0 as well. And what you already see is that it's added on top of our SVG. And that is because our SVG is positioned relative and simply takes up the space. And it takes up this space in the wrapper div. And because that wrapper div is position relative, making this tooltip position absolute will put it in the top left corner of the SVG. Now I also want to add a background color, for which we're going to use background slate 500. And we're also going to add a width of 48 and a height of 16. So this tooltip always has the exact same size, no matter what content is in there. And let's add some padding on the x-axis and also make it a rounded large and add a shadow of large as well. And now before we add in any dynamic data, let's just add in the data of one bar, so at least we have some data to work with. Like I said, all of the data is currently in a data file that we're using here. But if we quickly inspect that, you see that it's an array that has an object for every bar, and that has a data property with all of the different sections of the bar in there. So for now, let's go ahead and take the longest bar and simply render that statically in our tooltip. So that means that we need to take the 0, 1st, 2, 3, 4th index of the array and then use that data property. So let's use that here by rendering bars for a .data.map, and then we're gonna say data point. And for each data point, we're gonna render a div. That div has a key of data point.name, which is a unique ID in our case for the data. And then in there we can render a span, and that span is simply a self-closing span which has a height of 4 and a width of 4, so that way we can create a square that has the color of the current data point and is inline block, and then has an inline style where we add the background color of data point dot color. So this way you see that we have all of these blocks that are representing one of the bars. They are, however, in the reverse order, and that is because in the chart we're stacking them from the bottom and adding them on top of each other. Whereas when we're rendering the tooltip, we're rendering from top to bottom. So we can do that by, for now, simply spreading this into a new array and then adding dot reverse on it. So that way we are reversing the array without changing the original. So that way, at least for now, the order is correct. And later on, we can do this when we're dynamically adding the data. We can do this in a different way, of course. And next to that, we're also gonna add the dataPoint.name : dataPoint.value. So that way we see the different labels and values of every chart. We also still need to add a text white to our tooltip, so that way we can at least read things. And the wrapper we are gonna make display flex, so that way we can add a gap of 2, so everything is spaced evenly. And also make it item center, so everything is still within the center. So now we have all of these data points in there, but they're just overflowing our parent. That's not what we want. That's ugly. So there's a few things we still have to do to make this work. The first one is adding another div on here that simply wraps all of the data points. And this div, we're also gonna give a height of 16 and then also add overflow hidden. And that way only the items that fit within a tooltip will be visible. And you could have added this overflow hidden to the wrapper as well, but I also want to add in this shadow that you could see in the example video as well, that fades out the top and bottom one. For that, I did create a utility in our index CSS file that is called mask legend, and that uses a mask image to fade out everything that is outside of the center portion of our element. And to do that, we need to have this separate div where we can now add mask legend on, and that way we see that our top and bottom one are actually faded out. And we do that simply by applying this CSS mask. Because the way that mask works, everything that's fully black will be visible, everything that's fully transparent won't be visible, and because we're making a gradient from black to transparent, if it's, for example, 50% transparent, it will only be 50% visible. And that's why in this case you get the fade out effect. And like that, we already have the contents of the tooltip ready. The next thing I want to do is also make sure that we position it right next to the bar as soon as you move one bar. And then we can also show the right data based on that bar. And of course, if you use a chart library, they will probably already give you a function via which you can get the data of the current thing that's hovered. So in that case, you don't need to add all of these hover effects yourself. But since we're using a simple SVG, we're going to do this ourselves, because hopefully you'll still learn something from that too. And as soon as we added that, we are gonna add the scrolling within the tooltip as well. So first things first, what we need to know is which bar we're currently hovering. And every bar we're right now wrapping inside an SVG group. So if we inspect this, you see that all of the different bars are actually within its own group. So what we can do to know which group we are hovering is simply add an event listener on top of every group. And then if we hover that, we can do something with the name or the index of the different bars. And what we want to do with that is we want to store this in state, which you could call, for example, active bar index. And then we can go to our group and we can say on pointer enter. And I'm specifically not using on mouse over because on pointer enter is actually a more modern approach that will also work with all of the different touch devices that we currently have. Or touch, even if you have a device with a pen, for example, all of them will trigger pointer enter. So that way we don't need to listen to touch move, for example. If you just use pointer, it will work for all devices. And if we enter, we want to run a function that actually sets the active bar index to the current bar index. And on pointer leave, we want to reset it to null. So that way we're not hovering any bar anymore. And that way we can simply use this index to get the data from our data array. So instead of hard coding the bars4.data, we can create a new variable called Tooltip data, which is use memo. So that way we are not recreating this variable every time, only when the index changes. So then inside this use memo, we first need to check if we have no active bar index, then we simply return null. And then if we have an active bar index, return the data of the active bar, but we also need to reverse that. So in this case, again, we need to spread this into a new array so we're not manipulating the source. And then we're gonna run reverse on this. And that way we can go to our tooltip and simply map over our tooltip data here. Then this is going to give an error because it could be null, which it is if we haven't hovered any tooltip yet. So that means that we need to check if we have tooltip data and only then map our items. And of course, we don't want to show an empty tooltip, so let's also fade this out before we hover them. So let's take in the class names function again from the class names package, which is imported here from class names, which is a package I already installed, because that way we can add a conditional class name again. And in there we can say if we have tooltip data, then the opacity is 100. Otherwise it's opacity 0. And we're also gonna add transition opacity on there, so we see a nice fade in. So now if we hover one of the bars, we should see the tooltip fade in as well as the data for that specific bar. And that's correct. It's showing the tooltip for the bar and it's fading it in and out. Now let's also make sure that we put the tooltip at the right position. It should be at the position of the cursor and then right next to the bar. I'm again not gonna build a whole tooltip thing. I'm just teaching you techniques here on how to think within your code. So we're not gonna do a flipping around of the bar if there's too little space and things like that. But this is just to learn you a way to think. So to know where to position our tooltip, we need to know where our cursor is on top of our SVG element. So that means we need to add one more event. And that event we're gonna add onto our SVG component. And the event we're gonna listen to is onPointerMove. And what that event does is it gives us an event when we are moving our mouse or finger, if you're on mobile, over this SVG. And inside that function, we get an event as argument. So we can, for example, if we console.log event.clientX and also .clientY, and we go to our console, you see that we get the X and Y position of our cursor. But if we go fully to the left, we see that it's not 0. And that is because it's the client X and client Y, and that is the position of your window relative to your current window. So to know where we are relative to the SVG, we also need to know how far that SVG is positioned from the left and the top. And that data we can also get from the event. So I'm gonna create a new variable called SVG position, which is, like Copilot suggests, event.currentTarget.getBoundingClientRect. And this function gives us some data of the current target, which is the SVG. And that SVG position, for example, has a left as well as a top, which resembles the position of our SVG from the left and the top. So if we hover this again, you see that we always get the exact same value for both the left and the top because the SVG is static. And in order to know where our cursor is relative over our SVG, we simply need to subtract the two X values and the two Y values from each other. So we could create a new variable called X over SVG, and that equals the event.clientX minus the SVG position on the left. And if we also say Y over SVG, that's the client Y minus the top position. And if we then lock these two values and hover it again, you see that we get the exact position of our cursor over our SVG. And now, how are we gonna add this X and Y position to our tooltip? I think the most modern approach would be to use CSS custom properties or CSS variables. If we would set the X and Y position as a CSS variable on this wrapper div, then because our tooltip is a child of that div as well, it can access this variable and use it within the CSS. So in order to set this X and Y as a CSS variable, we need to be able to target this element. And targeting an element is in React usually done by creating a ref. So if we create a wrapper ref, then we can add this ref to our wrapper div. And then here we can say if we don't have any wrapper ref currently, then we return, because that could be the case during the initial render. But if we have a wrapper ref, we can say wrapperref.current.style.setProperty and then say X, which is X over SVG in pixels. And we let just Copilot to do the same thing for the Y-axis. And that way we have two variables now that we can use. And now there's fairly little we have to do, because in Tailwind it's pretty easy to position something based on a CSS variable. So instead of changing this left and top, I'm actually going to use translate, because that's hardware accelerated and it's just way more performant than moving left and top. So that means that we can add a translate X, where we then use square brackets and then minus minus X to target this variable. And we do the exact same for translate Y. And if we then save that, you already see that if we hover this, the tooltip moves along. It's like really right underneath our mouse, and that's not what we want, of course, but it's already moving along with our cursor. So let's quickly go back to our X and Y, and then we're still gonna add a tooltip offset variable, which is just a variable that I created, which is 30 pixels. That is what we're gonna add to our X, and that's what we're gonna subtract from our Y, so that way it is moved to the right, but also a little bit up, so it's kind of centered around our cursor. So if we now go back, you see that it floats on the right side of our cursor. And we pretty much created our very own tooltip. And please note, there is no accessibility added to this at all. This is just to show you how you can create these things yourself, and especially in a second, how you can create this animation. That's what I want to teach you, and not that you should build your own custom tooltips. But adding in that animation, that's definitely something you can do. But then you simply use whatever chart library you want, and that already gives you the right tooltip and positioning. The only thing you then need to do is the scrolling into place, but that's then pretty easy. But I simply didn't want to go into adding a chart library here and having to explain that to you as well, only to show you how to make this animation. So now you're here learning a little bit about creating your own tooltips and mouse positioning and things like that, which hopefully is way more interesting than implementing any other random chart library and me just reading out the docs. But now that's out of the way, I think the only thing left now is finally make this tooltip scroll into position based on which element you're currently hovering. And it's gonna be so much easier than you will expect. Okay, let's do this. So first, let me tell you what my plan is. For that, we quickly need to revert this and one more time make our tooltip data, which is simply bars4.data. So that way it will just always be in place and I can show you what I want to achieve. Okay, now watch this. So I've made the inspector a little bit larger for you so you can 100% sure see this. So here you have the tooltip, and I've inspected it right now. So every div you see in here is one of the different tooltips items. So if I, for example, click this one, you see a $0. And that $0 is actually, like you already see in a very small tooltip happening here, it's a nice trick in your console to reference this element. So if I clear this, I can type $0, and it will also have a reference to this element. It's only in the console, but we need that for now at least. What I can do with this element is $0.0.scroll into view. That's a function that's on any DOM element. And now watch the tooltip and see what happens when I press enter. It focused that specific element. It scrolled into view, and it did so within its own div that has an overflow hidden. And if we inspect any other element, let's go back up again. And then we use the $0, which now references another element. Scroll into view. And then we add an object and say behavior smooth. Watch this. Oh. That's why TypeScript is so nice. I made a typo. It's without a U, apparently. So let's do this one more time. If we take one element again and then go up, and then we write behavior without the U and run that, it simply animates it into place. And we don't need to do anything for this. There's no animations, nothing I need to do. Everything just works. So this is what we're going to use to animate this thing into place. That's the only thing we need to do. Let's go. And this, you already see, this is what excites me about Frontend. And there's no reason to make such complicated logic if you can do something cool like this with literally browser standard APIs. And that's what I think is so exciting about this video and about Frontend in general. Let's just make cool things. So let's do this. First, let's change that tooltip data back so it shows the right data again. And then we need to know which block we're currently hovering so we know what we need to scroll into view. And how do we do that? Probably again by adding a pointer event, right? Right, well done. So this time we're going to use an onPointerEnter, which is the equivalent of a mouse over. So it only triggers when you enter that element and not when you leave. And if you enter, we need to set the current section that's visible also somewhere in state so we can react to this. So for that, we're going to add a new state variable called active section index, and also add a set active section index that also takes in use state as a number or null, and as default is null. And then inside our onPointerEnter, we need to set our active section index to the block index, which I'm immediately gonna rename to section index because that way everything is the same. And if we onPointerLeave, we of course want to reset this to null. So that way we have a number that we can react to and that we can target within our tooltip. So to target them, we probably also still need a class name, legend item, for example. So that way we can target all of them and target a specific index within. Now we have this value. We can use this active index inside an effect to simply focus that element. So let's start by adding a use effect. And that use effect takes in the active section index. And then we say if we don't have an active section index, we don't do anything. But if we do have a section index, we can say document.querySelector. And then in there, we just say legend item. And then we add on top of that nth child, thank you Copilot again, active section index. So this adds 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 based on the active index. And that queries only one element. And if we find that element, we simply run the scroll into view function again. And that's pretty much the only thing we need to do. This way we look up the element that's currently in focus, scroll it into view, and call it a day, almost. Because if we now hover it, you see that the specific element automatically gets focused. There's nothing we need to do for this anymore. Yeah, there's a few things because it's focusing it at the top of the element. So we need to put it within the center first, but that's not too hard to do. We can simply add an object in here where we add block:center. And if you do that, it should center them. But there's one small issue I'm now noticing while I'm building this right now with you. That is that our tooltip array is actually reversed because we want to have the reverse order. So the indexes are not the same. So instead of using the nth child, I'm actually going to change this a little bit. And here we're going to add legend item dash data point dot name. So that way we create a unique class name for every legend item, and it doesn't matter what the order is it's rendered in, because we're using the unique ID, in this case the name, instead of an index, which could be anything in theory. But now we're not using an index anymore, but really an ID. So that means that we need to change this set active section index to, for example, set active section, because it's not an index anymore. And it should be bar section.name. So it will be a string. And then of course we need to go back up, change this here as well, active section, and make that a string. And also use it in the right places here. And finally, remove the nth child, because now it's just a class name that we can target where we add legend item and then the name of the section, the ID. So we can simply query them. And if we do that and hover, we see that the current element is always in the center. And in the center, it is because we added this block in here. Of course, we can still add the scroll behavior smooth on here, but you can also add that to the thing that's scrollable. So in this case, our overflow hidden div. You can simply add scroll smooth, which adds a CSS property scroll behavior smooth and does exactly the same thing. So that way, if there would be two places where you're doing this scrolling JavaScript logic, this div will always scroll smooth because it's set in CSS and not in JavaScript anymore. And that's really the only thing you need to do to have this scrolling logic, which is super neat. There is not a lot you need to do. One thing is this top element that's still not visible fully because there's not enough room to scroll. But we can just add a little bit of padding to this div, and then because we're using that scroll into view, that will automatically work. So let's add a py of 8, for example. And if we then hover this, you see that there's now enough room on top to scroll. So this way it's just positioned in the center again. And again, that's the only thing we need to do. Also for this bottom element, it just fits perfectly into place. There's one small extra thing we need to do, and that is to also make this work on mobile. Because if I quickly take my phone, let me show you what it does right now. So I've now opened this site on my phone as well. And if I interact with it, you see first that some text gets selected when I try to move my finger across it. And you also see that the page tries to scroll. And that is because this is the default behavior. If you interact with something and you try to scroll the page, you try to scroll the page. So there's two things we can add for this. The first thing is on top of our wrapper div, if we add touch none, and also select none, that means that we cannot select text in this component anymore. So that way we stop the selecting from happening. And also with touch none, we tell the browser that if we are touching this and interacting, we're not trying to interact with anything in the browser itself. So if I do this now again, you see that I can freely move my finger around without the page trying to scroll or trying to select anything. So that's super neat. Might be what you want, might not be, because if you now want to scroll, you need to go outside of the chart, of course. But I guess in this case it makes sense, because otherwise you couldn't move the tooltip around anymore. However, one more thing that happens if you touch this chart, and that is if you touch one, it activates the right element. But if I then move my finger, it won't trigger the touch action on any of the other bars anymore. It kind of captures the touch action and then it won't release it anymore. And that releasing is something on mobile you seem to have to do yourself. And the reason it's not letting go of this touch action is because it could be that you're trying to drag something, and in that case you don't want to release this. So the releasing we have to add ourselves. And we can do that by going back to our rectangle, which is every individual block in a bar. And on there we can add on pointer down. And this gives us an event, and we want to run event.target.release pointer capture, where we pass in the event.pointer ID. If we do that and we go back to our chart now, you see that if we now move over a specific element and go up and down, that it will always show the correct tooltip. So that way this is now also working on mobile. And these final tweaks bring us to the end of today's video. I am super excited about how easy it is to make interactions and animations like this, even without adding an animation library. I mean, let's take one more look. If we just hover this chart element, it's just so satisfying to see all of this move in place. And with very little code. So it's so amazing to see what we can achieve without adding a lot of complicated or big animation libraries. So please don't make it your default to always choose Framer Motion, for example, but always try to think what new solutions are there within CSS or the browser's standard APIs that I can use to also make something like this. Because the less code you need, the easier it is to maintain, the less performance impact it will have. Things will only get better, of course. And I really hope that with videos like this, I can inspire you to also improve your own front end, make these really cool and nice small details to your app, and also try to keep them as simple as possible. I really hope you enjoyed this video again. If so, please subscribe and leave a like. That helps this channel a lot. And also check out the Frontend FYI website, where you can find all of the code we just wrote, including a live playing around where you can just play around with this. Thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next video.